stop the recording when we get into the conversation. But Najma, Kai, Marina, thank you so much for joining. I'd love to start off with a fairly broad question, also as an opportunity for you to just say hello and anything else about your work and your perspective that you feel is useful to share. But starting off with, what are some of the principles for good inclusion in this space that you feel like would be a good place for us to start our conversation? And Marina, maybe I'll start with you, then Najma, then Kai.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and thanks for inviting me to join this space. Yeah, well, I think one of the things about young people and thinking about how to bring in young people into your work, whether that's to do with climate or else or otherwise, is that like the principles of good inclusion for youth are the same principles for good inclusion for other groups. Like they're like young people, taking young people seriously, respecting their time, thinking about the barriers that a young person feels as might experience as an individual to like access a space. Like those are all the same principles as thinking about trying to bring in and include other groups into your work. And like I liked how in that visioning exercise is some of the like barriers that folks were putting up and writing down and like saying that they're experiencing with youth. Like I think those are like just like general barriers for trying to do like inclusive and like radical and just work, right? It's capacity, it's time, it's like building trust. It's thinking about youth not as a homogenous group, but like thinking about youth as a very diverse group with ranging experiences and identity perspectives, and like trying to navigate that is challenging, but that's the same as with other groups. So if you are an organization that have been working on trying to bring in other groups for various reasons, like you're already like gaining a little bit of experience and practice that will be useful for experience, like for trying to engage young people. I think what maybe is somewhat unique about youth when we're talking about climate adaptation, which we can explore a little bit more later, and I want to hear from the other speakers as well, but like what's specific or special about youth engagement for climate adaptation is that young people are young and therefore more likely to be experiencing the actual impacts of climate adaptation work, since this is work that like whose impacts are cumulative and happen more and more into the future. So then thinking about the perspectives of young people as folks who will be living the impacts or the outcomes of the decisions that we make now. I think that's like the piece that sort of brings like that singles youth out a little bit as being like a specific group that's important to engage in this work, but principles for inclusion are similar for other groups as well.
Najma?
Hello, good morning or Bore da. I'm not sure if there's anybody else from Wales on this call. But yeah, I work for the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and we've just hit 10 years of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I'll do my best not to harp on about that for the whole call. But sort of the Act has 5 core principles, 2 of them being collaboration and involvement. So essentially all our public institutions in Wales have to do really good collaboration and really good involvement to successfully embed the Act. So collaboration definition that we use is working with other parts of your organization or other organizations to succeed. And, you know, for an example is if you're working for a public body and you're working on climate change, you need to sort of think about what the guys in health are doing around health inequalities, or what the guys in culture are doing and the effects that has on climate change and vice versa. And the other one is involvement, which I don't know if you're supposed to have favorites, but I really do try my best to do a lot of work on. And it's essentially involving people at the start of decision making. You know, in that word cloud was really interesting, that tokenism and, you know, a lot of those sort of words and tick box exercise and all of that was coming up. Essentially, really good involvement is just involving people from the start. If you invite, you know, if you've done a consultation, if you've done all the work and at the end you're like, oh, we've not asked X, Y, and Z groups. Oh, let's bring them in at the very end. This is what we found. That's, super tick boxy. They're not inputting into the direction or any strategic views or anything like that, and involving people from the very start, co-producing with them ideally, so they, have their views heard, is really, really important to, not just what we do here in Wales around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but a whole range of policies and everything that's happening. In terms of the involvement as well, then I saw somebody said it's not just one homogenous group, and it's great that we're focusing on the involvement of young people, but it's super important to look at it from an intersectional lens. You could be for example, when we're working with Transport Authority here in Wales, and they're like, oh, we need the views of young people. I could join, that would be great, and I could give my views, but I'm not going to be an expert in how to adapt that transport for disabled people because I don't identify as disabled. So it's more, you can have any young person on there. It's not, but at the end of the day, you need to have people with those lived experiences and people with those the knowledge of how to actually improve certain areas. And not every young person is an expert on everything just because they are a young person. So yeah, so really good co-production, and not seeing young people as one homogenous group, I think, is super important. Thank you.
Thanks, Najma and Marina. That was really good reflections and a lot of my own. But thanks for having me today as well. I also just wanted to platform a little bit of UKYCC's work and how we function, which gives a little bit more context of the perspective I'm coming from. But UKYCC is a volunteer, non-hierarchical, and consensus-driven nonprofit group. And we were established in 2008 in order to bring the youth voice to the COPs. And so since then, we've sort of learned how to work together in these like non-hierarchical and consensus-driven organizations. And I think learning from youth organizations and how they tend to like organize a bit differently is one way to sort of inform and engage youth and like take those learnings from people who've been like what Marina has been saying or what Najma is saying, like have been doing this work for a really long time. And often that sort of like lived expertise and experience of doing those sorts of differentially organized structures aren't necessarily valued or translatable to like worked experiences. And so what can we do to like learn from how youth are organizing in really innovative and creative and really impactful ways, and like what are youth doing that we're not doing in different spaces? So that might be a question that we could take forward. And also it increases sort of engagement and understanding that we're all a heterogeneous group. But yeah, in UKYCC, we work with the 18 to 29 year olds. So that's our like age group that is volunteering. And I think that that's something interesting that came up in the poll of like acknowledging that youth is like a very like disparately defined group of people. Like there are young kids and children who, engage differently in these spaces. There are like professionals who have been working in the space for 5 years, or early career researchers, or college students, and all of these people have very different lived experiences, and so it's important to meet like everybody where they're at. Obviously, that would just be like ideal in any search situation, which is like Marina was saying, is good youth engagement is good inclusion and engagement principles in general, is meet people where they're at. And I think that when I was listening to people talk, a couple of things came up for me around this idea of engagement over expertise. So acknowledge, like, what does that look like if we are acknowledging that experience, lived experience, and diverse perspectives, like what Najma was saying, is just as critical and important to informing, future strategies as are people with 20, 30 years on the job. So like, and how does that engagement look? And then also like partnership, not platforming. So around the idea of tokenizing like marginal perspectives in general. So youth being one of those, for example, of bringing youth voices to different conferences and asking them to speak and share their stories, but not having sort of consistent engagement and partnership and I think one thing that's distinct about youth, kind of like what Marina was saying, is like we will be living in this future, ideally, hopefully, in beautiful ways and contributing to it. But also, what's I think different about youth as a group is this like willingness and eagerness for learning and for sort of um, teaching and learning in like a relational format, because youth are looking to sort of upskill in a lot of ways and be a part of that. So what does like sort of long-term partnership look like with engaging youth versus one-off consultations or platforming? And like one thing that I've seen that's good with that is when youth are invited to sort of talk at COPs, or sort of any like nature dialogue series, is having sort of like debrief sessions after or prep sessions before on how, you know, youth can get the most out of a certain opportunity and bring it into their community long term. But maybe that's where I'll leave some of those ideas there.
Amazing. Thanks all. Yeah, so much in that. Um, love next to go. Noting in the Mentimeter poll, one of the common themes that came out was this work is really difficult, right? And it's yeah, how do we do it? How do we do it well? And I heard in all of what you were sharing, there's there's an importance in valuing this, right? It's not a nice to have. It's not a thing we should just do because we have to do it. It's incredibly important. So, what happens when you sort of flip this work, not in a case of this is something we should do and it will bring us useful information, and it's important to the what happens when it doesn't happen? What do we lose when different perspectives are not included in adaptation work? What are the risks? And that sometimes organizations respond better to risks than they do to sort of put added value. Yeah, I don't know if anyone. Yeah, we just have let's have a free form response on this one.
And I can come in. I think, it's a lot of the sort of long-term thinking I think we lose. Not being able to think what is the decision that we're making today and what impact is that going to have in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think especially in the public sector, a lot of the senior leaders have that short-term visioning to only think about the next 5 years, for example, or are really, really guided by budget cycles and that sort of thing. And then you introduce a young person into that conversation and they'll be like, oh, that decision, that's not going to look good in 10, 15 years time. And it's just, if you're sort of ingrained into a sector, if you've spent a lot of time, I don't know if anybody, there's a lot of public sector people here, but if you have been in that position for a long time, you do realize that the way you're thinking changes because of the pressures that are on the public sector, especially the budget constraints. It is really difficult to think long term. And I think young people bring that perspective of futures thinking, solutions thinking, and that sort of thing. So I think you lose a lot of that. And you would also lose the sort of, sorry, I've just completely lost my train of thought, but you'd lose the diverse perspectives as well, the sort of thinking outside of just one homogenous group. And we see that a lot with senior leaders are essentially one homogenous group that we work with them very closely. It's just essentially it is older white men that have been in that position for a long time. And if you're not thinking about the experiences of people outside of that, the decisions that you're making, you will lose, a lot of value, a lot of different solutions that could have come up and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think you would lose quite a bit without involving young people in decision making.
I can just build directly off of what Najma was sharing. I used to work for a research institute out of the University of Waterloo in so-called Canada, and called the Youth and Innovation Project. And they're a research group that is all about exploring how young people, like the unique contributions that young people in particular bring to the economy, to society, to culture. And they published some research basically saying exactly what Najma was just saying. So if you feel like you need some resources, I'll throw it in the chat in a moment. But finding that like youth in particular, like young brains, are often more likely to take risks, to challenge status quo thinking, are often more action orientated, are often more collaborative and creative, are more likely to like experiment, and to have like more like bigger visionary ideas and like ambitions that they're moving towards. And like all of those things are exactly what we need to tackle the climate crisis. Like we need all of those things. Like those things are critical. We need to be doing things differently and thinking long term, and taking risks and being creative and pushing against the like oppressive barriers of the status quo, to break them, and try new things. And youth are really important in doing that. So they're like a huge advantage to like bringing in people in a way where they're actually empowered, where we're actually empowered to be able to not just like share those ideas, but enact them, and try, and find the like impacts and results, and fail, and try again and like learn, like all those things that are like needed. And so it's not just bringing people in and expecting that, oh, they'll bring up a great idea if we ask them this question this one time, but it's also thinking about like what Kai said in terms of having that like long-term investment, and bringing in young people in a way that actually is meaningful, and shares power and leverages power rather than just like hoping to extract some of those ideas from them.
Yeah, and also just building off of that, you all said everything that I was basically going to say, beyond and mostly oriented around the status quo. Like, right, we don't accept, or many youth we're not as steeped in the same constraints, and so that enables like us to vision differently, and consider different futures. Um, and we also, I think we talked about this earlier on, but like we have different stakes as well, which in this future and in the work that's being done to, adapt and mitigate for this future. And so I think that that is an inherently an important thing that needs to be recognized. And I think people around the table and by actors in the space is it's not like a theoretical, action. I think like we all know this, but it's you know it's life meaning. And so we have different stakes in this kind of work and engagement, which inherently brings a different perspective to the table, I think, and that should be valued. But also, I was thinking sort of just more broadly in terms of like risks of not having that engagement beyond the creativity and everything that we gain is what do you lose is why you do any consultation to begin with typically is like buy-in. Like buy-in is so critical to sort of like these massive transformations, like at whatever scale you're working at, is adaptation mitigation is transformative work and like will require lots of changes to be happening at the social and behavioral scale and to not be including you in
Kai, lost,
this
we just lost you a little bit there.
is I think a risk to not having to go on.
We just lost
Sorry.
you a little bit there.
Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable. Am
We
I back yet?
Yeah, your image is frozen, but your audio is coming through more clearly now.
Sorry about that. Is that better without video off for a second?
Yeah, that's great. We can hear you loud and clear. Like the last 10
Cool.
seconds, if you can go back to where you were, that'd be great.
Yeah, no worries. I was just going off about buy-in and basically to not consult and engage youth in sort of these strategies and visioning around adaptation work is to potentially, risk people not buying in to the work that needs to happen or these futures that we're building. And that risks, more social backlash or more polarization, which is I think we're seeing increasingly in our cultures. So to not include the actors that are going to be directly affected by this work could have that as a risk.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. That's really, really interesting. So there's a lot here around almost the kind of existential importance of doing this work. We talked about, the value of it and the risks of not doing it. And maybe this feels like a good time to come back to this question of tokenism. And maybe before we get into that specifically, there's something underlying that I feel like you've all sort of talked about of power and this idea of, I can hear it in the partnership, not platforming, and it's not about um, uh, just bring people in a way that doesn't actually change the dynamic or change the way power is recognized or owned or shared. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is that balance between the sort of the dominant system, which does tend to be, older, whiter, maler, having power and recognizing that and letting go of some of that. And at the same time recognizing the power that other people have and other perspectives have. And so it's not about empowerment all the time, also about just acknowledging the power that inherently exists that maybe some of our professional systems or our policy systems don't recognize. These are now my words, so I'll stop there. But yeah, really interested in your thoughts on power before we get into maybe tokenism more specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you were saying, Peter, the first thing or the important thing at the start is to acknowledge that power exists in decision-making spaces and really thinking about who owns that power, where it's concentrated, and how it's used. And then really thinking about are you inclusionary when if you are in that position, are you thinking about, is it an inclusionary space? And is it more, back to the sort of tick boxing and consultation sort of idea and moving that from that to co-creation where people can have a real influence over decisions that affect them. And, I've worked with groups in the past and they're like, oh, we can't really work with Welsh government anymore. We've got consultation fatigue. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. You're brought in at the end of all these consultations to really as a tick box, and then later you're not being told about what that consultation meant, what it did, what it changed, and you're not really followed up on what any of your input or anything meant, and it is then they come back to you then with the next consultation. So it is about sharing that power, co-creation, co-production. I harp on about all the time. It is, I think, the key to really good involvement, getting people involved right at the start. So in my organization 5 years ago, we set up something called a Future Generations Leadership Academy. So the program is open to 18 to 30-year-olds that live, work or study in Wales. They do a 9-month program where they get trained up on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and then sort of do a social action campaign. The point of the academy isn't to teach them about the legislation, which is boring, or is not about understanding how they can do a social action campaign, but it's more about changing. It is a culture change to get your head around the act and how it works. It is a sort of systems change. And I did see a comment at the top saying, how do we get out of those silos? So it's more about teaching people to think differently, to think holistically across the organization, and to think long term and to think good about collaboration and involvement. And the program now, we've just finished the 5th year, is predominantly made up of young people that do work in public bodies in Wales. So kind of getting them early, I guess. So getting their head around this new way of thinking for eventually when they do get in those senior leadership positions, they've already got the sort of different mindset. And, after they finish the program, we really keep them involved in our work from the commissioner. If he gets invited to a lot of events, but if he gets invited to an event, he'll always ask, can I bring somebody from the academy with me? So they are also a panelist with him to make sure that their voices are, platform just as much as his. That's just one example of how we try to keep young people involved in our program afterwards. So yeah, they feel really the feedback we get is that they feel really valued, they feel like their voice is heard, and they feel like they're making a change. And then on the flip side for us, it's amazing because 10 years down the line, when all these young people are senior leaders, we've already got friends that are on board and thinking, the way that, would benefit the Future Generations Act in the future. Thank you.
I can jump in. Just getting my perspective on power. Big question. Super easy to address in a short moment. But maybe I don't know if this is exactly what you're going for, Peter, but something that I thought about. is that when I was working with Youth for Nature, which is a fully youth-led organization, like something that we did a lot is we worked with other youth orgs, but we also worked with non-youth orgs, quite large, more established organizations that have had everyone has their own capacity issues and restraints and challenges, especially in like environmental work and justice work. It seems like almost everybody in this space is like working with very full desks at all times. And like that is true, and I acknowledge and like respect that. But in comparison, like the resources that we had as a youth org, and then like working with larger organizations that are not youth led, and hearing them talk to us about capacity issues, sometimes like was hard to take. Now that I'm a bit step removed, I can look at that a little bit with a little bit clearer eyes, I think. But especially when I was in it, and yeah, working on a budget. Where everyone was working second jobs in order to afford to be able to do this work was a bit challenging. But something that I also found was even within like when working with these other organizations, the best, like most empowering partnerships and collaborations and like mentorships that we had was not always with like a full organization, but it was usually with just like one person in a larger organization that cared and wanted to use their position as much as they could to support and help us. And I hope that that is something. Oh, hopefully Najma comes back. I hope that that is something that is like empowering to hear, because it was like these individuals had the same like that had were working in these systems where they're often like very hierarchical like organizations or governments that they were working in. Or foundations or whatever kind of organization, but could sort of like recognize that, oh, if I care, and if I could use my voice within this organization to vouch for us, to sort of bring us in. I liked what Najma was saying about how the commissioner will also bring in someone from the academy to events, like doing things like that, opening doors, providing resources, financial or otherwise. And creating huge change for us, and also like creating change within that organization, like providing a bit of a model or a blueprint for how to bring in youth and building relationships with their organization with young people. So like that, I mean, that was honestly the most impactful and empowering for us. So just like being on this call and being interested, like I think trying to be a little bit like being a little bit ignorant to the systems that you think you might be beholden to, and like just trying to see, okay, what is like one small thing that I could maybe do to bring in young people, like that was honestly, it was just sort of one person that cared and wanted to help us out for the most part. And then that slowly changed larger organizations that they were working in, and also very much changed ours. So like these systems of power are here for sure. And there's tons of different ways that we can think about how to break or bend them or remake them. But it's not impossible for one person within a larger system to like do work that does challenge it. Like it's in fact maybe one of the best strategies is for one person that cares to try to challenge those systems.
Yeah, and I don't have that much to add beyond what I was thinking of, often or like marginalized communities and youth in this case, like we have power in spite of X, like in spite of current systems that like seek to like exclude or marginalize like um uh, more traditional power structures. And that is like that's not always a bad thing. It allows, youth to act more creatively outside the systems, but it also means power is working against X. And so I think what Marina was saying is how like what does sort of that intergenerational solidarity look like when it's power because power because, somebody within a group reached out to, a youth group or a representative or opened a door or, like questioned decision-making practices within their organization and like it doesn't have to be power in spite of, because like youth will continue to do this work. Like it's getting increasingly difficult, absolutely, and like the context is changing in a lot of ways. But that's not to say that power because or with is like off the table. And I think that that's up to people who are working in these systems to just like question what that might look instead, and yeah, like question the status quo or givens.
Thank you. And thanks, Najma, for rejoining. Great. I want to shift us into wider discussion in just a second, but maybe just before we do that, anything any of you want to say, taking what has just been said into tokenism specifically, as this came up as something in the Mentimeter poll of a potential risk or an anxiety or an uncertainty about doing this work. I don't want to do it in a way that is tokenistic. I don't want to do it in a way that exacerbates, unhelpful or harmful power dynamics, etc. Again, not as a tell us how to solve this situation, but just curious as if there's any, examples of good things that you've seen or things that from your perspective maybe kind of give you an indication of whether or not something is or is not tokenistic. Just really curious if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I have so many thoughts.
Oh, go on, Marina.
Oh, sorry, Najma. Do you want to go first?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Sorry for losing you all there. It's just a great time for a forced laptop restart. I think two things that work really well for us, and it has taken us a long time to get here. So I'm not saying that involving young people or any groups is easy, or especially when a lot of organizations have budget constraints or capacity constraints. But I think what's worked really well for us is not doing the one-off consultations like I was talking about earlier, but also compensating people for their time. So if you're asking people to come and give you advice or help you guide, the strategic objectives of your organization from, any equality, diversity or inclusion viewpoint, or even because we're really big on intergenerational thinking. So if you're involving older people in your work, just really compensating for their time, because it makes them feel valued. It makes them feel like you're not, just using their lived experiences in your work and be like, great, I'm glad you went through that, but it's helped us, and then just letting them crack on with it. So really compensating people for their time in some way or form, and then really keeping people updated with the progress of what they've been involved in. I've been involved in things in the past myself, and I'm just like, oh yeah, I did that once, and what happened with that? And you just forget about it. And so that's worked really well for us, but it isn't easy, and I acknowledge that. Thank you.
Yes, big claps on compensation. I feel like tokenism is just a lack of respect. Like that's what it is. It's not fully respecting like the time or expertise that a person is sharing. And that looks like one-off consultations for sure. And I think it's like good and right to be worried about that. Like there's research that bad participation is worse than no participation at all in terms of the harm that it can cause. So then what is good participation? Definitely like compensating for time, and that can look like lots of different things. It can look like literally, here's an honorarium, thanks for your time. It can also look like we're going to buy your bus ticket here or your train ticket so that you can come and share with us in person. We're also going to buy lunch, like we're going to provide for your basic needs and your ability to come and be here. Really love the follow-ups that Najma was sharing as well. Oh my gosh, so many things that you just get invited to share, and it's like, what did that even do? Where did it go? Where did like my time and insight and expertise go? Ideally, you're engaging youth in a way that goes beyond just the consultation, though, even if it's the best consultation you can possibly do. Like ideally, you're engaging young people in a way that brings them in from the start, which I think Najma also shared in the beginning. So you don't already have like a preconceived notion of what you want, but you're bringing in youth and you're bringing in their insights and perspectives from the beginning. And super ideally, you're doing that in a way that like affects the like decision making and governance of your organization. So bringing in young people onto your boards. I sit on the board of an organization called Global Witness. I used to be the youngest person on the board, but we actually just recently brought in someone who is younger than me now, which is great, which is awesome. But like bringing young people in that way, having maybe an advisory board or like a youth council that is like adequately supported and empowered, and where you are actually like in a place as an organization where you are going to take what they have to say and input it, and share back how that works. There are full youth-led organizations that will provide services for a fee to help you do this as well, like to help you like design engagement processes, and like more structural processes where young people are like impacting and influencing decision making. And it also looks like hiring young people too, like bringing in young people to be full like members of your group and of your organization, and like really valuing that. I think it's very challenging as like the job market for this kind of work is horrid, and it's very challenging for a young person to get their foot in the door. So bringing in youth, and as like full members of the team, is also like a way to engage youth that's less or not tokenistic. Yeah, I could go on, but I will pause there.
And I have absolutely nothing to add. I think all of those examples were beautiful, and all the things that we're thinking of, like youth board, advisory board engagement, long-term engagement, partnership, not platforming. And I think it goes back to the power thing around, if you're not distributing power, decision-making capacity, or something about your decision-making isn't changing as a result of youth engagement, then you're doing youth engagement wrong. Like there should be something changing with the way you're thinking and engaging with your work, ideally structurally, and that will be like the light bulb moment that you said, ah, yes, youth have been engaged here because they have led to X thing, or changed X thing. And so I think that that's how you know it's not tokenistic, and one way to make it pretty simple.
Thanks all. Really appreciate that. I'm just going to stop the recording now as we get into more discussion Q&A.